Hello guys, welcome to the fourth session of AngularJS. In this session, I'm going to cover controllers. In last session, we saw how modules works in AngularJS. In today's session, I'm going to cover introduction of controllers, use of controllers, how to set the initial state of $scope object, and adding behavior to the scope object. In my next session of controllers, I will cover the ways to create a controller, scope inheritance example, and do's and don'ts. So let's see what is controllers basically. But before jump into the theory, let's check out the syntax of controllers. So this is the old code, last previous session code, where we have initialized the my app module here, where my app angular.module my app, and here we don't have anything apart from modules ng app. Okay, so let's create one controller. My app dot controller, first controller. Okay, so as you can see, we have write a syntax of controller. My app, this is a module variable. Inside module variable, we are adding controller. Controller name is first controller, and this is the controller. This is the constructor of this controller, and dollar scope is a dependency which we are passing as a parameter in controller constructor. Now, this is about JavaScript side, how to create controller. Now, how to use controller in templates in Vue. So if we want to use controller, we have to use ng controller directive. Okay. So in ng controller, we have to pass a name of controller. Okay. So our controller is assigned, is very well defined, initialized. We can verify by just run it. Did we get any error? No, we didn't get any error. Okay, so what we did here, first we create a controller, then we added the controller to the module, and my module is my app. Okay, then we assign a name to controller, that is first controller. Then we create a constructor function, and in constructor function we pass the $scope as a dependency, which is a new child $scope object. It is automatically created by AngularJS. Angular assigns a $scope new child $scope as a parameter to the new controller. Now let's go to the theory. AngularJS application mainly relies on controller to control the flow of data in the application. In coming example, we will cover the flow of data in the application. Okay. The controller is defined using ng controller directive. As you can see, we have defined ng controller, and in ng controller we have assigned the name of controller. Okay. So a controller is defined using ng controller directive. Now what is ng controller directive? What it does? ng controller directive attaches a controller class to the view. So what it is doing, it is attaching the first controller to the view. Okay, this is our view. This is a key aspect of how Angular supports the principle behind the model view controller design pattern. How Angular supports the principle behind MVC design pattern. Okay, so ng controller is basically attaches the first controller class to the view. Okay, now what is model view controller? Model are the properties of scope. We have scope here. So models are the properties of scope. Okay. So we can define a property here. Dollar scope dot name is equal to test is equal to mark. This is one property. You can have multiple property. Number is equal to 987654321 So name and numbers are the properties. Okay. So dollar is models are the properties of the scope. So name and a number are the models, and dollar scope are attached to the DOM, where scope properties name and number are accessed through the bindings. We can access name and number through the bindings. We saw in our previous sessions, we saw how two-way data binding works. Same concept here. Now what is view? View is nothing else but the HTML template. Okay, with the data binding. Right now there is no data binding. We can add data binding here. Let's add the property for the clear picture of data binding. So temp view, the templates HTML with data bindings that is rendered into the view. Let's see. Okay, we got the mark and number. We got the name and number on the view. Right? Now next. Controller. Controller is ng controller which specify a uh, which specify a controller class. So ng controller is specifying a controller class. Our controller class is first controller, and this controller class contains a business logic to decorate the scope with functions and the properties. So this controller will contain the business logic. These are the properties, and in similar way you can define functions. Similar way you can define a function. So now we have a functions, we have a properties. Both functions and properties are attached to scope, and scope is attached to DOM. Okay, and we can access name and numbers of scope through the binding, data binding, which we saw in our previous session, two-way data binding. Okay, now let's go back to the theory. A controller is a JavaScript object containing attributes and properties function. Attributes, properties, and functions. Each controller accepts $scope as a parameter which refers to the application module that controller is to control. So as we see here, these are the attributes and properties, and this is a function which is controlled by a controller, right? And we have a $scope as a new child object as a parameter, right? So when a controller is attached to the DOM by the ng controller directive, Angular will instantiate a new controller object. So when this controller is attaching to the ng controller, then AngularJS is creating one controller object using this constructor, using controller constructor, correct? A new child scope will be created and made available as an injectable parameter to the controller. And new child scope is created, and we have already assigned, we have already inject as a parameter, right? Now, so this is about what is controller. Okay, so we have a controller here. We have created the controller. We have assigned the controller to ng controller. Everything is done here. So this is all about controller. Next, use controllers to set up the initial state of the $scope object and add behavior to the $scope object. We have already done it. We have added the states and the behavior. Behavior is nothing else, just a function. Now let's see how to get the function. Just return how this function works. Return, okay. Now we are going to see if will it return the name or not. See, so our functions, our behavior and properties are working very well. Okay, no problem here. Now let's go back to the theory and check it out. What is next? Next is setting up the initial state of a $scope object. Now what is the initial state, by the way? When you create an application, you need to set up the initial state for the Angular $scope. You set up the initial state of the scope by attaching properties to the $scope object that we have already done here. If you would like to see, we have already done it here. We have added the properties. It means we have added the states to the $scope object. The properties contains the view model. And now, what do you mean by view model? The model that will be presented by the view. Okay, so this name and number is a model, but it actually a view model because we are assigning a value to the properties or the model, but actually it view is representing these models. So these are called view models. All the $scope properties will be available to the templates. As you can see, these properties are available. Name and numbers are very well available here. Okay, at the point in the DOM, and all the $scope property will be available to the template at the point in the DOM where the controller is registered. Now, what do you mean by where the controller is registered? It means these name, number, and get name will be available inside this div only. If you try to access this outside the div, will it work? No, it will not work. Yeah, it is not coming, right? It is not coming because the controller scope is available inside this div only. It is not available outside the div. That's the meaning. All the $scope properties will be available to the template. This is the template. At the point in the DOM where the controller is registered. So controller is registered only for this div. It is not registered outside the div. If you want to run, then you have to assign it again. See? Just run it. You will get the values again. Okay, so this is the initial state of a $scope object. And what is the scope of controller, ng controller? Okay, so next is adding the behavior to the scope object. How to add behavior, adding a behavior to the scope object. Now, how it works? Adding a behavior is nothing else, just a function. If you are adding a function to the scope, it means you are adding a behavior to a scope. In order to react to events or execute computations in the view, we must provide behaviors to the. If you are manipulating a view, if you are doing some operations on the view, you have to define functions. It's very well understood. So we add behavior to the scope by adding methods to the $scope object. These methods are then available to be called from the templates or view. So like that only. We call the function from the template, right? It is available inside the ng controller only. It is not available outside this div. Okay. So this is all about what is controller, use of controller, setting up the initial state of $scope object, and adding behavior to a scope object. Now I would like to add two controls here. Second controller, the properties is Obama and the number is just some random number. Okay, using get name. Now define this second controller the place of second first controller. Now see, now the figures are changed. This is mark, number, mark. This is Obama, number, Obama. Why? Because the sec because these name, numbers, and get name are the properties of the scope, and the scope is attached to second controller. And these name, number, get name are the properties and behavior of first controller. That's why we are getting the property, we are getting the values of first controller. And in a second controller, we have a second scope, so we are getting a values and properties of second controller, right? So this is all about controller. In next session, we will cover ways to create a controller, scope inheritance example, and do's and don'ts. So thank you guys. Please subscribe my channel, like, comment, and share. Thanks a lot.